Coming up, the Brooklyn Nets suffer one of their first true blowouts of the season at the hands of the Philadelphia 76ers. What went wrong defensively? What couldn't get going offensively? And why does this sting so much for a team that has played well early in the year? We dive in coming up next.
You are Locked On Nets, your daily Brooklyn Nets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Yes, my friends, it is the Locked On Nets podcast right here on the Locked On Podcast Network. It's your team, the Brooklyn Nets, every single day. I'm Adam Armbrecht, sans Doug Norrie. We thank you for making us your first listen of the day. We're 100% free on all those great platforms. And let you know today's post-game episode is brought to you by Prize Picks, the easiest and most exciting way to play daily fantasy sports. Go to prizepicks.com/LockedOnNBA and use promo code all lowercase LockedOnNBA for a first deposit match up to $100. And unfortunately, on what is typically known as a football Sunday, we have to talk about the Brooklyn Nets really getting just beat up at home here, 121-99 at the hands of the Philadelphia 76ers. The 76ers, who after trading away James Harden, seem, as many franchises do, to get a bit of a breath of fresh air and find themselves now 10-3, also 4-1 on the road. So they do it all over the NBA. Nets drop below 500 once again here at 6-7. Now, we're going to talk about specifically on the Nets side of things, Mikal Bridges' performance, some troubling stats when we get into that third quarter, and then other, yes, still standouts when we talk about Lonnie Walker and a little bit of a larger sample size around one trend in Watford. But at the highest level here, I think the thing that really bothers us in this game is that the Brooklyn Nets just got beat up. And listen, if you told us in the offseason, what was this going to look like, right? How are we going to think this team was going to perform against some of the best in not only the Eastern Conference, but the NBA at large? And when we go back and remember that, yes, we had that early season win against the Miami Heat, played them well, tried to battle back in the most recent loss. Boston has certainly been a problem. But when you start to raise the expectation of what you think this team can do, regardless of the opposition, I think at times it makes it a little bit harder to then go into a game like this. They start off very sluggish, get down big, they close that gap, they fall behind again, going away towards 15 at halftime. Never really get the sense, as Doug and I often talk about, that the Nets were going to make a game of this one. So it definitely, it stings. Right now, they don't have Oubre in this one, and he had a very good start to his tenure with the 76ers early in the season, suffered that unfortunate hit-and-run car accident of all the things away from the court injury. And we know the Nets don't have Ben Simmons, and we know they didn't have DSJ, who we'll talk about, and we know that they didn't have Cam Thomas with his extended absence now for the team. So, there's a whole bunch of little reasons we could point to and say, yeah, well, what do you expect? But what it feels like we've expected is that regardless of personnel, the Nets are going to give you everything they got. They only went 10 deep tonight in this game. And a couple of the things that obviously jumped out here very early for the Nets. Perimeter defense was a problem. So we mentioned Dennis Smith Jr. here, and it's really been a theme. We saw this in the preseason. We saw it early in the season. Every time, especially when you have a player like Joel Embiid as well, but working that high pick and roll at the top of the key has been a problem. Tyrese Maxey getting the ball in his hands has been a problem, but there was far too often here when a very simple screen at the top was freeing up often Maxey, but whoever on the outside to have very wide open looks and at a minimum create easier free flowing ball movement. Tyrese Maxey in this game ends up knocking down 6 of 11 from deep. You want to add in fellow starter Melton, 4 of 6. So they go 10 of 17 from beyond the arc. And so many of these instances, and it's not picking on Spencer Dinwiddie, because without Dennis Smith Jr., and we highlighted this on a previous episode about his 110 defensive rating right now, he's the guy. He's the guy when it comes to backcourt matchups that can fight over the top or go underneath these screens and still find a way to get into the shooting space of the outside look, to make it a question about whether or not you want to run off that three-point line and drive in towards the paint or continue that pass around the outside. It just was not there for the Brooklyn Nets in this game. And this is, by the way, what you would call a Doug Norrie special if we think about The Nets need to shoot a lot of perimeter shots. That needs to be their bread and butter. Even if they're not going down, you have to keep firing. Because as we mentioned, those two key players, arguably the most important when it comes to these outside shooting, 17 attempts between the two of them alone for Philadelphia. Those beyond them, a total for this team in Philadelphia of 35 attempts from the outside. So, you're talking about half of your shots came between two players. The Nets only had 28 in this game and went 11 of 28 for 39%. So you combine these two categories, and it really did feel like the thing that has been a problem for the Nets, even regardless of the success of Dennis Smith Jr. when he's played, not on the offensive end, specifically just defensively here. When you don't have a player like that, it feels like that's always going to be this losing uphill battle for the Brooklyn Nets over the course of the game. That's kind of, to me, one of the two high-level things that really unraveled this one. Now, again, when we talk about a team not playing with what we would say at least two of your top 5, 6 players in Cam Thomas and in Ben Simmons, that's the other part of this, the perimeter defense, right? Whether or not we know that Nicholas Claxton and Ben Simmons will ever share the court or intentionally want to overlap those guys, it certainly looks a lot different when you have a player in Ben Simmons that can get that out there on the perimeter and then still have a trust. It can be Nicholas Claxton. It can be Day'Ron Sharpe. It can be the switches when you talk about Dorian Finney-Smith having to take on battling Joel Embiid inside of the paint. Whoever it may be, the Nets just did not have the extra body to help them manage that. Tried to go to a zone look a couple of times, didn't really make much of a difference. So the theme inside of this blowout loss just being didn't have it. And again, at the highest of levels, I often, I think Doug has joined me in this a couple of times over the course of the season. You come in a loss and you say, listen, I hate to break it to you, there's still going to be silver linings. There wasn't silver linings in this game, right? You give up 38 points in the second quarter there going towards the half. You give up another 33 in the third. You're held to 22 in the first and third quarters as well. You don't break 100 points, right? It just looked like you were gassed, or you looked like you didn't have, and you knew you didn't have what it was going to take to be able to battle the 76ers with consistency. We'll talk about the other side of this. Mentioned Joel Embiid there in terms of setting up some of these screens, but what was the difference when we talk about him getting into the paint? That matchup is always going to be difficult for any team, but again, functionally, the defense just did not look like it quite had the assignments locked in or the ability to commit to getting in and out when it comes to the around the basket defense, and then still deterring some of the perimeter looks and just general ball movement for the Philadelphia 76ers. We'll get into that coming up here in just 1 second. But before we do, got to tell you about our friends over at Prize Picks. That's because that Prize Picks is the most fun that you could have, winning up to 25 times your money this basketball season. You just select 2 or more players, pick more or less on their projected stats, and place an entry. With basketball season well underway, you can now pick combo projections across both football and basketball from the Specials League, a league that's created specifically for combinations that include 2 or more players from different sports leagues. For example, you want to get a little LeBron James action. You want to get a little Travis Kelce action at 10.5 combo of 3-pointers made plus receptions. You can do all of that. And if you want to play alongside some of Prize Picks' favorite players like rapper Meek Mill or comedian Andrew Scholes, you can go ahead and now find the community plays under the promos tab of the app to view entries from some of the biggest names in the Prize Picks community each and every week. PrizePicks also offers you the reboot policy so that you know if your entries stay alive, even if one of your players gets injured. Whether it's football or the NBA with the Brooklyn Nets, Cam Thomas, we mentioned him, Ben Simmons, we've mentioned him, right? No Dennis Smith Jr., we mentioned them. If one of your players exits the game in the first half of it, you can also turn back around, and if they don't return, you know that player is going to be rebooted. And Prize Picks is the only daily fantasy sports platform with an injury insurance policy. So go to prizepicks.com/LockedOnNBA and use promo code all lowercase LockedOnNBA for a first-time deposit match up to $100. That's prizepicks.com/LockedOnNBA, all lowercase, promo code LockedOnNBA for a first deposit match up to $100. Prize Picks is daily fantasy sports made easy. All right, so as we continue the conversation around the Brooklyn Nets and the 121-99 loss at the hands of the Philadelphia 76ers, when we go inside that team stat category once again here. Now, listen, by the way, let's be clear, some of these numbers, minute shares and stuff, especially when we get talking about Trendon Watford, This is white flag territory on the back end of this one in the fourth quarter. But 94 shot attempts to just 81 for the Brooklyn Nets over the course of this game. That's a problem. We also talk about the free throw shooting here. Gosh, you'd be shocked to say you held Philadelphia to just 18 trips to the line, but you only get there 16 times. This has been one of those categories that's certainly been a struggle for the Nets. But then the other side of it is you won the rebounding battle. Now, again, these numbers get messed up here in the back end of it, but 44 to 45, you were hanging tough inside of it. Far more a distribution for the Philadelphia 76ers here as well. And while this game was still with the starters and with the core players on the court, the Nets only had 12 fast break points in this one. And that was on, as we at that time, they said it's 5 turnovers total here, 4 at that point for Philadelphia. So they were turning relatively few turnovers for Philadelphia, maximizing them on the fast break opportunities and getting out in transition, but an incredibly clean game from Philadelphia. So that's the other part of this, right? If you're not going to find ways to be disruptive and get some of those turnovers and force some mistakes, you're really giving yourself an additional uphill battle as well. Now, the other player there, first and foremost, as we talked about, Tyrese Maxey, I mean, coming out party for him over the early portion of this season. Feels like the 76ers are going to be doing their own little personal celebration party, getting James Harden out the door and kind of clearing the space for Maxey to take on this expanded role. 36 minutes for him. Now, he's only 8 of 20. Said 6-11 from deep, just 8 of 20 from the field overall, but he gives you 25 points. Melton gave you 21 points, and then 32 from Joel Embiid. Again, relatively bad shooting night, 11 of 24. He got to the line 10 times, the bulk of the lift there for the 76ers in that regard, the 12 rebounds, the 9 assists. And this is what it comes down to. And you put Maxey in this category as well because he had 10. So 19 combined assists here. Go back to the idea of when you're talking about setting some of those pick and rolls, it's just the over and under fighting of screens was a losing battle all game long. And the other part of it is the entry passes and the feeds into Joel Embiid when he was in the paint. It really just felt like it was his time to decide which way he wanted to go. There was some early effort by not only Nicholas Claxton, and then that's a hard matchup, as we know, not just for him, but for anybody, but also by Day'Ron Sharpe, too, just trying to play some physicality underneath the basket. But Joel Embiid, man, those entry passes into the paint were really get that ball, survey, make your decision. And when the Nets were trying to collapse that defense to congest the paint, the outlet passes were all too easy. The Nets were a half a step, maybe even a step and a half late, getting back out to the outside. So the looks and the plays coming off of some of these setups for Philadelphia on the offensive end just felt all too rhythmic. You go back to those turnovers, too much rhythm, too much ease of play here for the Philadelphia 76ers. And anytime you look back up, as we said with Embiid, 31 minutes, he got to sit himself down and relax. It highlights the fact that this game was one going away. Now, the other thing, too, before we talk about, some of the bright spots, and that's more just season-long narratives, not so much about inside of this game. Mikal Bridges. So we go back inside this box score here, right? You have Mikal Bridges, who ends up playing 29 minutes. Again, everyone's going to get truncated here on that. 16 points he had in the first half of the game. 18 points is what he finished with. 8 of 12, 2 of 2 from beyond the arc, 3 assists to go along with it. So on the one hand, stop it at the first half, take away the box score, take away this game. Just, hey, he's being productive. We're seeing a highly efficient night from Mikal Bridges. He didn't take his next shot until under 60 seconds in the third quarter. At some point, and we understand that we're evolving our opinion of Mikal Bridges. Not that he is not an incredible talent, not that he isn't one of the leaders of this team, and not that he can't be a very efficient and high-volume scorer for this team. But clearly, it's not the same thing that we thought it was over the last 27 games of last season. Nevertheless, when you don't have Cam Thomas out there for you, you need to be one of the engines of this team. And sometimes you say, well, that can be misleading, right? The distribution, obviously some looks don't go down. That's fine. But you cannot walk away from this game and listen, the third quarter, let alone, right? Doesn't take his first shot attempt until under a minute in the third quarter. And then you really don't see a ton of them in the fourth. It is borderline criminal to not take over the game at some point. And Doug and I talked about this, I think, in our post-game live after the traditional podcast last time out, where if it's not an injury, which I don't necessarily think it is, there's just a fatigue factor here, there's a mental drain here. The early portion of this game says, oh, he's coming out of it and he's finding it. But you can't go away for 12 minutes of a game. Even if you're dialed in defensively, even if you're trying to lock up your assignments, even if you're trying to find teammates, When you are down your other lead scorer in Cam Thomas early in this season, and when you know that you have a guy like Lonnie Walker, who we'll talk about coming up here in a minute, who has been highly effective game over game, it's no longer a blip, it's a trend with him. You got to find a way to just take over, take control, and say, yeah, I need to go be a high volume guy. 12 shot attempts is not enough. Him and Cameron Johnson had 12 attempts apiece. You had Spencer Dinwiddie with 10. It was an off shooting night for him. He did get to the line. He did distribute pretty well. But this needs to be a bigger volume game here for him. And I just think it's unfortunate, not even inside of this one, but not having Ben Simmons and not having Cam Thomas. I think we keep finding ourselves asking the questions of, okay, what's going to be the perfect version of this, or the best version of it, I should say? How are we going to maximize the value of the players we have on this roster? And I think so far, and it feels a shame to say it, because even though, it's a quiet and non-existent fourth quarter for the starters for the Nets, Mikal Bridges, he would have put up 25 points probably, assuming that he took a few more shots, or at least over 20. We can safely say that. So we go back in and we think about the fact that he's giving you 23 and 21 and 27, 31 and 20 and 19, right? You go back and you look over the initial run of the season, and you just feel like 24 and 20 going back to the start of the year against Cleveland, against Charlotte. All the box scores tell you that's been a pretty good year for Mikal Bridges, right? Because he shot 52% from the field in the first month of the season. Over the month of November, he has, by the way, dropped off considerably, only shooting 43% from the field. Yeah, he has a couple, 1, 2, 3, 4 really ugly shooting performances over the course of November right now. And then you dump in some really bad shooting performances from beyond the arc. Some of those numbers have come up, but by and large, the perimeter shooting games have been inconsistent at best, or he's had a couple of little spikes here, like we go back to that game against Washington, 3 of 5, but again, under 38% from the field on that particular day. Oh, sorry, that was free throws in that game, excuse me. 2 of 14. That was the absolute clunker of a game from beyond the arc. 1 of 6, 1 of 4, 1 of 5. The perimeter shooting is its own thing. Once you find a rhythm of going 9 of 17, 6 of 15, 8 of 12, you're starting to see some more consistency from the field. Now I just need more volume. You are one of the best players on this team. And even when Ben Simmons comes back, it'll change the dynamics and it'll create some different looking opportunities. You still are one of the engines of this team. Even when Cam Thomas comes back, you still need to be one of these engines of this team. So it was disappointing. It was a frustration there for me personally when it came to Mikal Bridges inside of this game, and just that sentiment of, oh, here's a player that can go away for big stretches. The other things, obviously, even just beyond this loss, are the performances, as I mentioned there, of Lonnie Walker. Really mattered tonight, and I think matters for the season going forward. Want to have a little bit of a broad discussion on him. And then Trendon Watford. The sample size is here. This is a guy that arguably, and I'll highlight some of the numbers here, he might be the best player in several key statistical categories and deserving of a larger sample size. Unfortunately, without being fully healthy, it's really hard to create that hierarchy across this team. So let's take a look at those two players, talk a little silver linings, and then remind you about the schedule ahead and why the Brooklyn Nets need to be prepared to start stacking a handful of wins to make sure the early season positive vibes carry over as we work towards that 20 and 30 game mark of the year. We'll get into that coming up in just one moment. Before we do, though, got to tell you about our friends over at FanDuel. Oh, you know that it is, of course, the NFL season in full blast. NBA is well underway, but you can score early in the NFL season with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Right now, new customers can get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 money line bet. That's $150 if your team wins. You go over there right now, right? So $5 money line bet. Well, why don't you go over to Monday Night Football? Why don't you look at the Philadelphia Eagles visiting the Kansas City Chiefs? The money line bet, you can just take Philadelphia. They're plus 128. You think that it's Kansas City and they got the home crowd, two of the best in the league, minus 152. You place that money line bet, you go ahead and you grab yourself $150 in bonus bets with that winning bet. So go ahead, make your choice. Dive in now. If you've been thinking about joining FanDuel, there's no better time to get in on the action. The app is so easy to use. There's a wide range of betting options, including spreads, player props, over-unders, and so much more. So visit FanDuel.com/locked-on and kick off the NFL season. FanDuel, an official betting partner of the NFL. All right, so as we wrap up our post-game podcast episode talking about the Brooklyn Nets and the unfortunate 121-99 loss to the Philadelphia 76ers. Now, we said it at the top, but it's worth repeating. This team has surprised us so far this year. This team has also dealt with injuries more than we thought or hoped they would have at a minimum to start this year. So the fact that we sit here at 6-7 when we look back over the course of their schedule and tally up the losses that they've had, I think you really still look at this team overall and say it's a positive, it's a positive early season narrative. The concern here is what is going on with Ben Simmons. We'll get more information on that soon. Cam Thomas hopefully is going to come back here towards the end of this month at minimum, we think, or at latest at the beginning of December. Get that back into the flow here. The talent and the depth that they've been able to utilize has been tremendous, and it's helped them keep their head above water in a lot of these situations. We've had surprisingly strong performances, key contributors, guys that we haven't even talked about now in games, like an Armani Brooks, who gets brought up and shoots lights out and then goes back down to the G League. But the players that have really carried their weight here, specifically Lonnie Walker. I mean, you talk about a guy, 32 minutes, 9 of 17, 6 of 11 from deep, went to the line just a couple of times here, but gave you 6 rebounds to go along with 2 assists, 26 points on the night for him. He's been a machine. He has been an absolute machine. He's averaging almost 16 points a game. He's averaging 3 rebounds, the field goal percentage near 51%. But it's the consistency, really, that you've loved from him. And we've talked about this before with guys that come up, okay, yes, you can come give a spot fill, but once you start asking too much of a player, it's going to be hard for them to maintain it. Well, Lonnie Walker is proving that he can maintain it. He has had, over the month of November, only one clunker of a game. He went 2 of 8 against Washington, the game where everybody shot horribly and the Brooklyn Nets still won 102-94. I mentioned that about Mikal there before, a 5-point game. Other than that, double-digit scoring in every single one of them. He's been phenomenal from the field overall in almost every single game. And the shooting from beyond the arc, outside of 2 games, the Miami Heat most recently there on Thursday night and going all the way back to Chicago at the beginning of November. Low volume, low percentage. Other than that, 3 of 7, 3 of 7, 3 of 4, 3 of 6, 6 of 11 tonight. That is the highest volume that he's had from beyond the arc. And then you can go back into October there, obviously, where he had great performances, 19 and 14, respectively, against Charlotte and Dallas. He's the real deal. He is the new 6th man for the Brooklyn Nets. When Cam Thomas comes back and he's inside of this starting lineup, there is going to be a shuffling of the hierarchy here in terms of how this team is constructed and how they're going to have success. And we know like Royce O'Neal has played very well, and he's a consistent player by and large. But having a guy like Lonnie Walker, and I said I want to talk a little bit kind of big picture on a player like this is why down the road, if you can, when you can, you look to get what you can for a player like Royce O'Neal, for a player like Dorian Finney-Smith, because you've already done the right thing in the offseason, giving yourself these redundancies. So he's been phenomenal. Doesn't change the disappointment of this game. Again, I have to compartmentalize this. I've talked about silver linings in losses. That's not what this is. This is a season-long silver lining that the Nets have an absolute steal in Lonnie Walker, and it looks like you could be talking about him being a double-digit contributor with consistency throughout the course of this season. Had an absolute monster jam, by the way, in this one too. Some knee issues early in the year, a little bit of balking for a handful of games. Looks like he's 100% healthy in that regard as well. The other guy that I want to note here is going to be Trendon Watford. Now, listen, he has a relatively small sample size. Coming into this game, I'd only played 85 minutes for the Brooklyn Nets. So, we're not really, even if he's averaging 15 minutes a night, 5 games of sample size here. And I think that's around what he is, 14 minutes a game. And a game like tonight is going to skew that a little bit because he ends up playing the bulk of the fourth quarter as well. But when you go over and look, and this was coming into tonight, I had pulled these numbers up, and I'll be curious to see how they flesh out with just more of a sample size. 126.1 offensive rating, 110.2 defensive rating. You go over and you look at the true shooting percentage, 63.2. And this is a guy that's not just doing it at the basket, right? We know he has the perimeter shot as well. 18.8% usage when he's playing. These type of numbers for a guy like this, you have to start to consider, and let's include these as well, his assist to turnover number, 2.17. All of these are among the best for the Brooklyn Nets. I backed out a guy like Armani Brooks because he hasn't played a ton for this team. 13.5 rebound percentage is behind only, I believe, Ben Simmons and Nicholas Claxton, or maybe Nicholas Claxton and Day'Ron Sharpe. Only two guys that he's behind. Now, you can sit here on the one hand and we can say, yeah, but it's sporadic playing or a really big night here and then some quiet nights there. We'll double down on these as we head into the week and look at where these numbers rank following this game as well. But he is a player, and tonight, utilizing him again as a point forward type of player, right? Putting him into some difficult matchups defensively. And he had some moments where he didn't quite execute properly on the defensive end. He had some clunky possessions on the offensive end. Again, inside of a game like this, I'm not going to spurn anybody too hard for errors made along the way. But he had a couple of sequences, even beyond him bringing the ball up the court, obviously. The passing for him, I'm going to ask Doug this question this week, and I'll pose it to everybody here and on all of our accounts, YouTube and otherwise. Rank him. Rank him as a pure passer on the Brooklyn Nets. Where does he stand? Because he made some great no-look passes. He had some beautiful bullets to the corner to try to set guys up for outside shots. He just seems to have a natural flow for the game. And even on ball, he took it towards the left wing, worked a spin move, drove into the paint, ended up being called, I think, for traveling once he got in, moved his pivot foot when he tried to stop in the paint. But the sequence there was, here's a guy playing at a forward position who can ball handle, who can take a guy off the dribble, who can get into the paint, create his own space and shot. These are things that the Brooklyn Nets need. And I don't know realistically how long it's going to take or if it's going to be possible for some of these guys to carve out larger roles. Because what I mean by that is, at least in the short term, when Ben Simmons comes back, whenever he comes back, or when Cam Thomas comes back, right? You start to do the hierarchy here. As good as Trendon Watford, I think, is playing in this sample size, it's going to take an active decision from Jacque Vaughn to say, you are deserving of a consistent role that's going to take away from a Royce O'Neal. It's going to take away from a Dorian Finney-Smith, not because they're one-to-one replacements, but because the minutes have to come from somewhere. And while he's played really well, can you just totally eliminate Day'Ron Sharpe, who, again, I thought had some nice sequences tonight? It's not all perfect. So, that run to 240 minutes, it just gets harder and harder to compartmentalize him. The, shame on me, silver lining of having these injuries early in the year is that you've been able to get looks at these guys and confirm. Lonnie Walker, great pickup, right? Trendon Watford, great pickup. So we're going to see here as we move towards 20 games, 25 games, how do we think this can shake out, and where does this team stand right now? The last note as we get out of this 121-99 loss for the Brooklyn Nets, again, it's a bad loss. It's against one of the best teams in the league. You live with it. You move on from it. And the reason why the Nets need to move on from it, and we'll go into this deeper as we come up here, because the Nets won't play again until the 22nd with the Hawks at home at the Barclays Center. But that full schedule coming up, Brooklyn Nets got through the early portion of this season. And I said, well, where their losses come? Cleveland, Dallas, Boston, Milwaukee, Boston, Miami, Philadelphia. Those are 7 losses. And we said, hey, you want to try to steal some of those? Well, they did that against Miami, right? They did it against the Clippers. So they did it. They got a couple of these stealing wins early in the season here. But coming up, and I'm sorry, the Atlanta game is on the road in Atlanta. So they'll go for that one road game, but then they come back. And the next handful here, the next 5 games following Atlanta is the homestand. Miami, Chicago, Toronto, Charlotte, and Orlando. Those games are huge because when you come back out of them, you're going to go on the road for a big trip. It's going to include the Kings, the Suns, the Nuggets, the Warriors. It's going to be hard to get through that road trip and feel like, hey, staying close to 500 is going to be the agenda. But this homestand here, you need to listen, might be one of the rare occasions throughout the course of the season we say, hey, there's a 3 or 4 game winning streak here, right? There's a 4 out of 5 scenario here potentially. And it's going to have to start with a really difficult gut check matchup here already. 3rd game of the season against the Miami Heat. Going to have to find a way to go toe to toe with them. But Chicago, Toronto, Orlando, Charlotte, wins. Let's get wins. And if you do that, then you continue all of this early season momentum and positive vibes. And hopefully we're talking about over these next couple of days, getting some updates around Cam Thomas and what it looks like for him. That being the case, Doug and I will be back in, obviously, Tomorrow, we said, not going to play again until Wednesday. So we got a couple of days here to lick our wounds, look back at this game maybe a little bit deeper, talk about some of the adjustments we might want to see if the injury report is going to remain relatively the same heading into that Atlanta matchup on Wednesday night. In the meantime, you get over to YouTube, you subscribe, you tell all your friends about it. Even on an NFL football Sunday, there's still NBA basketball to talk about. You also get over on social at Locked On Nets on X, at Doug Norrie, at Adam Armbrecht. And of course, we actually have some exciting stuff. In addition to doing the game day previews, which we unfortunately missed today, mea culpa on our end, over on the podcast feed, we also have some other exciting stuff that we're going to be announcing in the next couple of weeks. We want to continue to give you guys who have been loyal supporters of us and helping us just love and enjoy talking about the Brooklyn Nets. We want to give you guys as much content and as much access to us as we can. So stay tuned for that as we move along. And if you are watching live on YouTube, that means next up is the Post Podcast podcast. Until next time, though, as always, when there is no Doug Norrie, there is no quote. Short of saying that I miss my friend, and I can't wait until he's back so we can keep talking all things Brooklyn Nets basketball. All right. When the post-game podcast ends, the post-game podcast begins with you, the Brooklyn Nets faithful. We talk about a wide range of topics from the most recent game to season-long narratives. We're going to get into it all live on YouTube coming up next.
You are Locked On Nets, your daily Brooklyn Nets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Yes, my friends, it is the Post Podcast right here on the Locked On Podcast Network, where it is your team, the Brooklyn Nets, every single day. I'm Adam Armbrecht, getting it in with you guys, the Locked On Nets faithful. You're the Brooklyn Nets faithful, but I'd like to think you're also the Locked On Nets faithful. If you have a comment, if you have a question, get in over on the chat at Locked On Nets. We address the issue right off the bat here. Where is Doug Ian? Listen, it's one of those things, right? Call him a fair weather host. No, I'm just kidding. Doug, listen, sometimes weekends are hectic. Sometimes we have to divide and conquer, and that's what it is today. There'll come a matchup when I can't bring myself to make it on for the post-game discussion, and then I'll leverage old Dougster. Tell him it's his job to handle it. Take a look through at any of the questions that we had here. Again, I'm assuming the sentiment, I would like to think, is that this is just, 76ers, it's a rough matchup. It's a hard game to win. It's a hard matchup when you don't have Ben Simmons because he does so many different things defensively, specifically from a size standpoint. You'd like to have him be a part of this. I didn't want to dwell too much inside of the episode on him or any of the most recent episodes as Doug and I do them because not out of sight, out of mind, but you guys get to get back healthy, right? I could spend 40 minutes talking about how, if you had Cam Thomas, that would help, right? Nets could score a lot more points than 99 if you had a guy like Cam Thomas out there. Dennis Smith Jr. To that point as well. I've seen some recent stuff here as I just look through for some of the questions or comments that you guys want to get in on. I've seen some recently these comments about, we'll give Trendon Watford more time, which is a sentiment I can get behind, but it's like, you don't need any more DSJ. No, you do need him. Like there's these very specific matchups and situations that's exactly why he's on this roster. And it's the one thing about when we say, well, the Nets are a very deep team. They are. They have a lot of depth and a lot of talent. We've seen that. But they still don't have a ton of depth in the backcourt when it comes to either one, ball handlers, or when it comes to point of attack defense, right? Like you need somebody that can fight over those screens, that can be that pest. And DSJ has proven to be that over the course of his career. So it's just really hard to get through it. To get through games like these when there's still some deficiencies here. Mira Slayer, you were in here on the last episode as well. Thank you, good sir. At Locked On Nets, Cam versus Maxey. Who you taking? Yeah, I think, listen, I'll reserve commentary on that battle until we get like a full season of Cam Thomas being in the starting lineup, being a big part of what this team does, right? Like Maxey, although he's going to take a much bigger and more expanded role over this upcoming season now that they've kind of cleared out some of the other players here. And it's just, now you're starting to identify him as one of the young talents. He already has a pretty big history and track record of being successful at a high level and being a part of winning basketball. That's not a knock on Cam Thomas. It's just the reality of like what the what the Nets haven't been when Cam Thomas has been able to get into games. So Maxey's a heck of a player. The defensive side of things is really good for him as well. So I think, being a little bit of a two-way player helps him in that situation too. But I'm going to take Cam Thomas because he's a Brooklyn Net. That's all that really matters. I'll take Day'Ron Sharpe over Joel Embiid as well. Let's get into John Ramey Dorval. Spencer and Royce need to get traded due to Watford and Lonnie playing time. Yeah, okay. So this is a part of, I didn't want to go a mile deep on the traditional episode, but when we think about like Lonnie Walker's performance, when we think about Trendon Watford, again, I don't think necessarily that the Spencer Dinwiddie, that's not necessarily the one-to-one that I would look at, but I look at Royce O'Neal and I look at Dorian Finney-Smith and I think about the G League and Dariq Whitehead and getting healthy and getting some playing time and Jalen Wilson, whatever he is or he isn't, but we've seen him over the course of camp. And obviously, if you watch him down in G League, he's being productive down there. So I think about these guys that have some length and have some size and wanting to clear out some of those minutes so that you can get some players that are at a minimum offensively going to create a little bit of a different dynamic for you. So, whether that ends up being Royce and Dorian Finney-Smith, we'll have to see. Whether or not Spencer Dinwiddie could go, we know expiring contract, $20 million. I don't expect him to be here going beyond the season, but Spencer Dinwiddie does a lot of the things you need. So clearing him out of the way, who's one of the better ball handlers and one of the better facilitators, it's, and at least has been trying to carve out his 3-point shooting this season, which I actually wanted to take a look here real quick about whether or not, let's talk about Spencer Dinwiddie. How's his 3-point shooting been over the course of this season? Because we did spend a lot of time this offseason saying like, hey, when you go back to this time in Dallas, when you have a guy like Luka, yeah, certainly the 3-point shooting is going to be better. It's going to be best. And that's what it was when he was there. So he only shot those seasons in Dallas, 40.4, 40.5, not only, but that's when he was there. But just before that, Washington, 31%. Last couple of years in Brooklyn, 33, 31, 29. Here's what you can like about it, nay, love about it. He shot just 29% when he came over in the trade last year in those final 27 games. He's shooting almost 39% this year. So he's been finding a way to still have that level of consistency in that category in spite of not having your traditional superstar out there on the floor. Now, the one other thing you can note here is that in the last 2 games, 1 of 4 and 2 of 7 from deep, had a big 5 of 10 against Orlando, but a goose egg against Washington. So he's been a little bit up and down here, I'd say. Started out the season better. Those 3 games in October are much stronger. Although, again, a big volume in there, 6 of 12 against Dallas, kind of skews these numbers a little bit. Like he has 2 really big performances, 6 for 12 in October, and then again, 5 of 10 here against Orlando that are gonna boost his numbers a little bit. But I don't know if he's the guy that I go to. I do go to Royce. I do go to Dorian Finney-Smith and think about what's possible there. Let's see here. I got a little one from Ian here. I think you were just up on the board as well, and that's okay. Both Claxton and Spence due for 20 million renewals. Can we afford it? Well, Claxton is going to be more than 20 million. I think Claxton is probably 25, maybe even more. Probably 25 million a year kind of player, just based on what his talent is and based on potentially suitors that are going to come to the table on him. Spencer Dinwiddie is interesting. Going back to last year after the trade, I thought it was interesting that there was talks, or at least like speculation, that behind the scenes the Nets were saying they'd like to extend Spencer Dinwiddie. He's the oldest player on the team right now. If you wanted to extend him, I wouldn't be against it depending on the number. No, if you're talking about $20 million for Spencer Dinwiddie on an extension, not going to happen. The Brooklyn Nets aren't going to do. They can't afford to do that. Because remember, you're still going to have the Ben Simmons contract next year. You have these other numbers that live on the books in Mikal Bridges, even though it's a more team-friendly deal, in Cameron Johnson, even though it's a descending contract. But no, you're not gonna bring back both of these players at plus 20 million. Nicholas Claxton is going to have to be a hard decision that the Nets are going to have to make. I would commit that money to him because I can see the path forward over the next 2 and 3 seasons. But then you also have to think about a couple of years from now and Cam Thomas. If he gets back on the court here healthy and he continues this incredible assault offensively on the league, you're going to be talking about him getting a potential big contract as well. So Spencer Dinwiddie, I wouldn't say I don't think the 20 million is going to be the number, and certainly it's not going to come from the Brooklyn Nets, in my opinion, anyway. What else do we got here? My Holy King, what up? Well, you know what? Yeah, sure, I'll throw it up there. I was gonna say I'm not gonna throw it up there. It's just a little shout out to us, but well, we're vain. We're vain here on Locked On Nets. So my Holy King, a frequent flyer for us as well. I'll just remind everybody here as we're having the conversation. I'll scroll back a little bit and take a look at the comments. That we have some different things that are going to be coming up here, as I mentioned, in the near future. So we want to try to find some ways to give you guys as much access to Doug and myself, make it a little bit more fun, a little more interactive. So stay tuned for that kind of stuff. I know that's a vague and cryptic advertisement, but it's coming. So we're going to keep it going here for sure. What was the other one that I saw here coming from? I'll take a little look at this one here. When you're doing these flying solo, you got to take a beat just to read through, make sure we're playing it clean. Here we go. If the Rockets wanted to be competitive this year, why didn't we ship Mikal and Cam J for our picks back? It feels like we are the Bulls all over again. I don't agree with that. If you're talking about the Bulls this season and what they look like, and they're not going to be competitive, it's different. Why? Because the Nets are competitive. The Nets are winning games. Like, the Nets are a good team this year. Chicago is on the precipice of dismantling things. And now, listen, if you want to categorize teams into competing for championships and not competing for championships, the Nets are closer to the Chicago Bulls than they are to the Boston Celtics. But you have the Bulls coming back and beating Miami the other night, and Zach LaVine is shrugging off the PR and walking off the court. So you know that he wants to be gone from there, obviously. But the Nets, not problem here is, but their path forward is going to be about what is the next player that you add in, whoever that looks like. There's some superstar names we could talk about that could come up. Okay, do you want to package off those picks? Do you want to stand pat and say, hey, let's keep trying to win games. Let's stay competitive. Let's make the playoffs. And then next season, the year after, as we get down to the last couple of years, the contracts of Mikal Bridges or Cameron Johnson, yeah, then you have those discussions. But we know one of the main paths to winning is getting that superstar name. Understand you may wanted to have shopped them. And I think if you wanted to do that in the moment at the time, you could have. We said that about maybe a Dorian Finney-Smith, certainly, although he's been phenomenal to start this season for the Nets. But you still have to field a team. And I know the Nets didn't want to be, and I certainly didn't want to be, watching a team that had no hope of going out and playing competitive basketball, especially because they don't control their own picks, right? Like, they don't control their own picks. And you're saying here about the Rockets, trade them off there. Well, it's also, if you think that the Rockets were going to be willing to give up that high of a potential draft asset, it's possible. And right now you're kind of doing the one and the other. Well, if you traded, you have Mikal Bridges and you have Cameron Johnson, so those picks are getting devalued the more competitive that you stay. If you traded those players to the Rockets, then the Nets don't have anybody. They go into full tank mode and they try to get that top pick. Listen, it's not a path that I would be wholly against. It's just not the path that we're on. And I'm sure there's plenty of teams that came and called knocking. We know the rumors last year were upwards of 4 first-round picks for Mikal Bridges on pass-through offers. Unless they're going to be those top lottery assets, I think there is a certain point when you take a pause and say, well, all of the 25 through 30, 30 picks in the first rounds of NBA drafts isn't necessarily going to help us. And we have a pretty significant volume as it stands right now. Going through here, not going to highlight Anthony's comment. I don't think I agree with you. Again, one of the things that you shouldn't have coming out of a game like this is a sense that this team is terrible. You played against one of the better teams in the league and you got beat up. Like, that's it, right? There's not a lot else that you can really say about it. See what else we got here before we close out the door. Anthony going up and in again here on the hiring of Jock Vaughn. Listen, I'm probably acknowledging negative comments more than Doug Norrie would care to. again, the early season return on this team has been by and large positive. They've won far more games. Again, I'll go back to it. Now, right now, by the way, just from a standing standpoint, you got to see how Cleveland plays. You got to see how Atlanta plays. And that's why that Atlanta game actually is pretty, you can just kind of circle it, little mini circle it as being pretty exciting here early. Orlando Magic, another important game as well, because the Nets right now are in 10th spot in the standings. They have a game in hand. Oh, sorry. Cleveland, Atlanta have a games in hand. So their next matchups are going to matter. And the Nets are trending on the slightly negative side of the point differential margin. It is, though, the reason why, as I had mentioned, that schedule coming up, it's critical for the Nets to renew the belief that this team is better than the mid and lower half of the NBA. And Atlanta, by the way, they're not a scrub team. I just mentioned Orlando. They're 7-5. They're not a scrub team, but they fall into the category. By the end of the year, you don't expect Chicago to be around after they dismantle it. Toronto could be a team that ends up selling at the end of it. Charlotte is the team that's absolutely struggling to start the year. Orlando is a team that wants to win and wants to be competitive, so they're in the mix. But that homestand needs to be filled with more wins than losses. Is 3-2 good enough? Maybe. Do I want to say they can lose the first game at home against Miami in that stretch there and then still come back and win the next 4, even add Atlanta into that, even though it's a road game. So over these next 6 games, what does the record need to look like? For me, it needs to be 4-2. It needs to be a 4-2 record because you're beating up teams, or winning games, I should say, not beating up. You're winning games that you feel like you should win. Take a look here at L. Rob, who's just throwing up some rumors here. Rumor is Phil is looking at both LaVine and Caruso in a package deal. Yeah, I mean, listen, once you went through, if you're Philadelphia, the travesty that was the James Harden experience, you move off of him. Maxey's really looked great. This is the difference. A lot of people, a lot of teams have talked about, and fan bases are talking about, what about LaVine? You do not want, or at least in my opinion, I believe Doug agrees with this, you do not want LaVine as your number one. And guess what? In Philadelphia, he's not the number one. Joel Embiid is. But so he fits on teams that already have an established number one, and then he can be the elite number two playing off of him, right? And take over games for big chunks, etc. But that I've heard Knicks talk about with LaVine and wanting to get in on those. I don't know if that'd be the answer for them. I don't know what next level that takes you to. So when we said too, we did our bonus episode, you can go find it exclusively on the podcast feed talking about Chicago and the money on LaVine's contract, let alone with the opt-in, I think 2 seasons out for $50 million. He's going to pick that up. So, when you think about all those things being factored in, I would not sign up for that. If I'm the Brooklyn Nets, I do not sign up for that. I want there's very few players, by the way, that I sign up for the Nets to go all in on or to sacrifice significant draft capital. The interesting footnote about this stuff is that there has also been the speculation that the cost from a draft capital standpoint may not be as steep for some players as maybe they were over the last couple of seasons with some of those monster deals that have been made. So that factors in too. If I can get Caruso, I'd take Caruso. But if I got, that's always been a pipe dream over here as well. Let's get a look at this one here real quick before we get out the door. We won't stay too long on the solo show. Feel like I just get lost spiraling in my own head. Is it wrong to believe that our 2 injured players could have contributed to a better winning record? No. Nets for lifer. Of course not. Of course not. Your best offensive weapon in Cam Thomas. I mean, in this season, isolated, he's the highest point getter. I mean, well, Lonnie Walker's going to give him a run for his money here, but of course, right? Firepower, on-ball creation, ISO creation. You need that desperately in these games that he's missed. And then Ben Simmons, for whatever he is not, he's a table setter, he's a facilitator, and he also represents a significant defensive size upgrade and versatility upgrade as well. So no, I mean, I'd have to go back and look here. Simmons, what was the last time Simmons played? Was it in the Milwaukee game? Ooh, that's a good question. Is there any games in there that they would have won? I mean, you can go back to that Miami game, I think probably 122-115. They made a little of a late push there. If you have both of them in that game, I definitely, get that back to a coin flip kind of mentality. The Boston game is going to, Lonnie Walker leads you in the categories there. I don't think that's going to make a difference. And tonight, again, if they're both on the court, it's an entirely different game. It doesn't mean that I think it changes much, but you can probably say you buy yourself one more win. And that's kind of the funky part about this, right? Like the Brooklyn Nets have had a great start to their season and you miss these players, but the games that you can win, I think here's how I'd put it. The games that you kind of look at on the schedule from afar and say, hey, there's some scheduled losses here. At full strength, I think, there's scheduled losses. And if you're in injuries, you don't say, oh, if we just had these guys back, we could win those games. I more look at the matchups like I talk about coming up here, Toronto, Charlotte, Orlando, games like that, Utah. You talk about Detroit, you should be, even if you're not 100% healthy, you should get those wins as well. It's games like that. Like maybe the New York matchup is an interesting one. Like being at full strength can make a big difference there because New York has some size, needing DSJ maybe for the Brunson matchup for different stretches. So there's things like that that I think I look at there, but it's not about, oh, we could beat some of the best teams if we're at full strength. I think we give everybody a run when we're at full strength, but it's mostly about we can be better. Everybody is full strength in the entire league. We can be better than a lot of teams on a night in, night out basis. What we get here from Mira Slayer. If we were to go all in on any one player in the NBA, who is at the top of your list? Anybody? I'll take Luka. No. Of the guys being talked about, I mean, that's a good question. Tongue in cheek, but like Luke, if I going on anybody, Luka's the guy that you want. It's the combination of the size, right? He's an incredible offensive player, table setter, gravity of what he is. There's probably some bigs that I would obviously look at. I know that it's like Cat's going to be talked about a lot as this season progresses because they could try to Minnesota tweak kind of who they are, even though they're winning a ton of basketball games. And he has that big contract coming in. But do you want to have that kind of money on the books? I don't know. That's a good, you know what? Mirror Slayer, let's go ahead and make the note. We're doing bonus episode. And we're gonna break it down into of the available guys, of the guys speculated to either be on the trade market or believed to be over the next season potentially available. I think Doug and I'll do one on that. That would be a lot of fun to take a look at, even though sometimes you got to dream a little dream. Let's see. Any last looks here? Ian, back up. How do you think we will go in the next few games? One we need is Toronto for the NBA midseason tournament. Yeah. So listen. I'm an in-season tournament guy. I believe in it. I believe in supporting it, and I believe getting excited about it. So, as you say, that Toronto game is that's going to be, excuse me, that's going to be the last in-season tournament game for the Brooklyn Nets. And if you wanted to, if you care about it, we can go ahead and have a little conversation on that. We'll do an update around this stuff too. But the in-season tournament right now, the Nets are kind of in a tricky spot because I'll pull this up in the background. Because when you go over and look at the standings right now and the point differential, which is obviously a massive factor in this. So here's where we stand right now for the Nets in the East Division. So Pacers have only played twice in theirs. And you have the 76ers now 2-1. So next game really matters. But what's nice about Group A is the point differentials for these teams. Philly has just a 4-point +4 differential. So depending on how the Pacers do, they have just a 5+ differential. So they could be very much around it. If Philly goes and blows somebody out, that's going to change it there. In our group right now, in Group B first, the Bucks are going away with it. The Heat are a problem now because they're 2-0 and they've got +7. And the Knicks are 1-1. They're +8 right now. So you need, Nets can get say to 3-1, winning that Toronto game. Excuse me. But you got to get that point differential up a bit more. Nets are currently 2-1 and a +3. Chances that they catch the Celtics here seems unlikely. So they need to get that point differential above the Heat. Maybe have to have it be above the Knicks as well to claim this one wild card. I feel slightly less concerned about the Pacers at 2-0, and hopefully they drop a game here because I don't remember. I haven't looked at who they went up against in their two matchups. But if they have to go head-to-head with Philly along the way here, that can change it. If they have to go against the Cleveland Cavaliers, that could change it. So hopefully they kind of knock themselves around there, and the wild card is going to come out of Group B or our group in C. So the Nets need to go all out, though. In that game against Toronto, it needs to be not unlike what they did against the last matchup that they had, excuse me, which was against the Magic. Blowout win. You need a blowout win, 15-point victory over the Toronto Raptors, which I'm not just sitting here say no soft task, so that you can give yourself the best chance of it. If they can get that number closer to 10 plus or more, then you got yourself a good opportunity, hopefully, to make that wild card, which I think matters. Again, why not root for more basketball? Why not root for competitive basketball? And then you get into the wild card, and there's going to be a lot of elite teams getting talked about there, but it'll at least be fun to go ahead and enjoy that. I know that somebody, and I see Rakeem is mentioning Harry Giles. Thank you, Taz, for being a part of it, buddy. I appreciate you. Really, I sincerely, we say this all the time. We appreciate everybody that comes in, shows support, even on a football Sunday, even on a blowout loss effort. I appreciate anyone that comes in and helps support the podcast. Yeah, I saw there Rakeem talking about Harry Giles. I knew it was going to come up. Doug probably wouldn't even address this at this point. Although in games, we always say if it's a game that you lose, then you can start to have more discussions about things you could or should have done. The only difference that I'm going to remind everybody about here is like when you get garbage time minutes, that doesn't mean nearly as much as it would if you were playing, minutes against the upper echelon of teams. You did get Harry Giles playing in the fourth quarter here for a mere 6 minutes. He goes 2 of 3. He takes a 3-point shot. That's something that matters for bigs, the threat of it, and he does get to the line. But hey, listen, that's a story for another day. That being the case, we're going to go ahead and tie a bow on the post podcast, which is now going to be an extra feed. If you don't get an opportunity to listen to it here, you can go and find it over on the podcast feed as well. Shout out to Jared. Listen, buddy, you came in right at the tail end, but you said hey, and that's all that matters. I knew you were in here. Even if I didn't see you, I knew you were a part of the conversation. And yes, in fact, God, that game was horrendous. Thank you to everybody that came in and joined us. We'll be back again tomorrow talking about injury updates, diving a little bit deeper on some of the things we didn't like about this particular game, and then maybe getting into that discussion about how should some of these rotations and depths rotate a little bit here, at least in the short term, while the Nets continue to manage some of their injury concerns. Until next time, we will be back again talking all things Brooklyn Nets basketball.